Welcome to the Head Shepherd podcast. I'm your host, Mark Ferguson, CEO here at NextGen Agri International, where we help livestock managers get the best out of their stock. Before we get started, thank you to our two fantastic sponsors for continuing to sponsor this podcast. MSD Animal Health is perhaps better known as Cooper's Animal Health in Australia and for their Allflex range across the world, with a comprehensive suite of animal health and management products. Honiger is a one-stop shop for wool harvesting and animal fibre removal. The Honiger team have a deep understanding of livestock agriculture, backed by Swiss engineering and a family business dedicated to manufacturing the best. We are grateful to our sponsors for their support, helping us bring Head Shepherd to you each week. And now it's time to get on with this week's episode. Welcome back to Head Shepherd. Great to have you listening along. Another great episode today with Claire Taylor. Claire's just started a new consultancy, which we'll cover. She's recently moved to Australia from Scotland to chase a bit of a love interest, as you'll hear about in the show, but also is ready to really, help Australian or Trans-Tasman Ag really to up its game around Agvocacy, as her company is called. So making sure that we tell our story in a really good way and be transparent through that. Anyway, it's a great show. I'm sure you're going to enjoy the listen. Before we get into that, I just wanted to mention an article going on the Hub that's just gone on the Hub last week, which is written by our own Dr. Emma Pettigrew. It's called Breeding for Worm Resistance and Resilience in Sheep. Really key topic out there at the moment with people struggling with worm resistance and drench resistance in worm populations. So our chemicals aren't working as well as they used to, and a real struggle for many of us. And so Emma works through the opportunity to improve how the sheep themselves handle those worms, which a lot of you will be interested in and something that's a key focus of us. And so, great article there. Jump on the Hub again. The Hub's the place to be if you want to get our articles every week, and really do recommend you sign up to our newsletter as well. That comes out every fortnight. Gives you links to everything that's happening at NextGen Agri, a bit of a spiel from me normally around whatever's top of mind, and great to keep in contact with what we're up to. Jump over to www.nextgenagri.com and sign up for the newsletter, or head over to the hub.nextgenagri.com to check out the article that Emma's written, or Google any of that stuff and up it will come. Also wanted to quickly mention the Foot Rot Focus Forum that's happening on Monday, April the 14th, 8 p.m. New Zealand time. So that'll be 6 p.m. in the east and 4 p.m. over in Western Australia. We've got Herman Rusma coming on. We've got Charlie Douglas Clifford. We've got Jim Walsh and Kim Kelly from MSD and myself talking about foot rot. So a great live there on the Hub. Again, jump on the Hub and sign up to that. We've tried to pull together all the aspects. So from the vets through to a farmer who's really been implementing a lot of the strategies around breeding. Herman Rusma, who's a guru of the genetics associated with foot rot, and really helped me when we were setting up the foot rot breeding though, and I'll be there as well. For a bit of comic relief. So, really do recommend jumping on there. If you can't attend and you've got some questions you'd like answered, email Sophie at nextgenagri.com. She will definitely bring those questions to those experts and make sure they get answered, and you can watch the responses on the recording. Again, if you can't make the show, can't make the live, the recording will go up not too long afterwards. So that'll be a great one if you're struggling with feet. Some of you are a bit dry for that at the moment, but when it does start running again, feed problems will start to be back, no doubt. And quickly, final call for OptiU. We've had some really good interest, so we're just trying to pull together those pilots at the moment. If you've sort of been meaning to get in touch and haven't yet, make sure you email Emma P at nextgenagri.com or info@nextgenagri.com, and we'll make sure you're all part of that. Righto, we'll get underway with this week's show with Claire Taylor. Welcome, Claire, to Head Shepherd.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Excellent. Great to have you. And great to have you in Trans-Tasman agriculture. And we'll get to how that came about. But we might start at the beginning, as we often do, which is kind of growing up in Scotland and maybe how you ended up in journalism from that background.
Yeah, so I grew up in the southwest of Scotland in a place called Ayrshire. My family, we have a kennels and cattery business, and we also run belted Galloway cattle, which are native breed to Scotland, but also particularly to that area of Scotland as well. They're a great animal. And from there, I was involved on the farm when I was small, but really I wasn't part of young farmers. I wasn't really that focused on the agricultural side of things. And I went off to university not to do journalism, but I did politics and international relations, went off to Edinburgh University, left the country life behind. And it was coming out of university, I actually ended up at the BBC because I was really involved in athletics. I was a national athlete, and I ended up doing a sports reporter traineeship at the BBC. It was a wonderful sort of introduction. It was during the Commonwealth Games. But when I was there, I ended up moving into news, and I worked in the BBC for a number of years, actually as a TV producer. But at the same time, some big events happening in the UK, one of which was Brexit. And I was very aware at the time that Brexit was going to have, and is continuing to this day to have an impact on agriculture. And the BBC wasn't really covering it. It was a very urban focused coverage, very much the Central Belt. And I kept on bringing in copies of the Scottish Farmer newspaper and saying these things are going on and no one's covering it. And I actually made a decision that I was going to leave and cover what was happening within Brexit, because even the papers at that time in farming didn't really have much of a political focus. And that was my real interest. So I left it was in 2017, and I joined that Scottish Farmer newspaper and became, at that point, a news journalist. And then I moved my way up to being the political editor of a farming paper. And for years, I covered the impact of Brexit on agriculture and multiple other stories of an agriculture at the time. But I was there for about 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, cool. And so obviously, I've never been a journalist, and I'm just going to but obviously part of that job is reporting what's happening and not really having to influence what's happening. But obviously now you've moved, or over that career, you've moved from sort of reporting what's happening to try and influence what's happening. Is that how you've always been, or is that something that you've sort of developed along the way?
I'll probably say here that I'm probably not a very good journalist, in the fact that I've always been someone that gets around a cause, and it probably gets a bit personal for me. I've always been quite an emotional person. I've loved the sort of David and Goliath, how can we champion the voices of those that aren't heard? And I was known as that back home. So particularly rural communities that weren't having stories talked about. And I've always ended up probably taking stories to government and trying to get them interested and around the table. So maybe journalism traditionally is you're following the news cycle, and you're that neutral party. And although my reporting was neutral, I tended to always have that thing within me that I just really deeply cared. And because I've always been passionate about people, rural communities, and that agricultural side was always there. And I guess what happened from my journalism is that I was asked to become a columnist. And as a columnist, you got an opinion. And I started writing a column for Scotland's biggest broadsheet paper, The Herald. It was a non-farming paper. And it was amazing for me because it was an opportunity to speak to a non-farming audience. And it was every single week. I got around 1,000 words and speaking to, multiple thousands of people. And it got read by, all politicians and all different stakeholders. And it was probably then that I realized, gosh, agriculture probably is speaking a little bit to an echo chamber. And that was, for me, it was like, okay, moving forward, how can I continue to be quite simplistic in my language? I've never been an academic. I've always been very straight talking, simple in the way I communicate. And that's what cuts through when you're talking about what can be quite a technical subject. To speak to people that don't know about farming, that probably worked really well for me. So that's what I sort of saw as my strength going forward, was being able to go into those rooms and have really simple but powerful conversations about agriculture. And I've been so passionate about farming because when I started the Scottish Farmer, I knew about cattle, I knew about livestock, but suddenly I opened, a whole new world about agriculture in Scotland. And then obviously laterally I've traveled the world and I've seen agriculture in different ways, which I know we'll get on to. But I think I just became, a real advocate of people in farming who I didn't feel were being heard and being appreciated. So that's been sort of my big passion, Mark.
Awesome. And there's a quote that I'm going to butcher, but there's something around you have to understand something well to be able to explain it simply. It's the people that try and sound intelligent and the ones that understand it less is often so. Yeah, simple works well in all walks of life. Obviously. Well, I think I came across you because of your Nuffield, and that's how you ended up cruising around the world, looking at, I guess, broader out of Scotland, looking at agriculture, what was happening. And so, I guess we've had lots of Nuffield scholars on the show, or a few anyway, and we'll have many more as we go through the podcast. But I guess what prompted you to do a Nuffield, and what was the focus of that study?
If you've had lots of Nuffielders on the show, I'm sure everyone does know what a Nuffield is, but it's a really quick summary in case they don't. Maybe I'm being a bit too much of a journalist here, Mark. But it's there's around 100 individuals every year around the world, lots of different countries represented, who are given the opportunity to travel, to learn about agriculture around the world, and to bring that back as a learning to their own businesses or to their own country, or much wider than that as well, to influence change. And that could be change of thinking or change of practices. And I applied for a Nuffield. I'd been thinking about it for a few years. People had kept coming up to me and saying, have you ever thought about it? And like many Nuffield scholars, I kept saying, I don't have enough time. I'm too busy. And every year I got busier and busier. And then there came a moment around 3 years ago where I'd just seen such a step change in agriculture. As a journalist, I'd been going to conferences, and suddenly conversations weren't productivity and profitability. Conversations were all about climate. They were all about, what are you doing as farmers to mitigate your emissions? What are you doing to benefit and support nature? And though a lot of those conversations were really positive, I did feel at the time a lot of farmers felt quite threatened. They felt their identities, their livelihoods were being challenged. And I was hearing constantly from farmers, because I was constantly on the ground hearing, our livelihoods are being under attack. Governments aren't listening. They're not interested. The public are disconnected, and the media are out to get us. And as a journalist, I kept hearing, you support us, you're a farming journalist, but the rest of media, they're out to get us. And having been at the BBC, there definitely wasn't we're out to get farmers. They just didn't know. It just wasn't an understanding. So I knew straight away there's definitely, there's a link in the conversation that's missing. But I thought, if there is what farmers feel is this real anti-farming agenda, maybe it's something I need to look at. And I thought, through a Nuffield, I could travel around the world and look at whether or not that anti-farming sentiment was growing globally, and to look at how agriculture was responding to that increasing scrutiny. So that's how it began for me, was let's go off on an adventure. For me, I wanted to learn about farming. I wanted to make lots of friends in farming around the world. I think there's networks that are really important for the future of agriculture, but it was to look at how could we see how agriculture was responding to scrutiny, and then come up with a plan moving forward to make sure those negative narratives are really being superseded by that more positive point of view.
Cool. And I guess, we'll get to a little bit more about what you found, but we might just take a sidestep and have a yarn about how you actually ended up moving to Orange. And obviously it was the lure of Mitch Hyatt. And I guess, was it always the plan to move out of Scotland, or you're only human. Obviously the attraction to Mitch was too great, or?
Oh, you'll love hearing that. Well, I certainly wasn't planning to find an Australian farmer in my travels. And it's funny, Mark, when I'd always saw myself, it was always going to be Scotland for me. And I love Scotland. It's always going to remain a place in my heart. And who knows where I'm going to end up in the future. I'll be back there all the time. But once I left on my Nuffield, and I'd sold my house in Scotland, I'd quit my job. I was probably, I'd been quite impulsive because I knew this was a once in a lifetime opportunity. I didn't have a plan to go back to. So I was open to the opportunity of moving, and actually I can share more about it later, but it was Zimbabwe, particularly in my travels, I probably learned the most, and I got this strong sense of wanting to return to. So that was part of the plan. Then I ended up in New Zealand for 7 weeks and spent a lot of time with farmers. And I remember them saying, "Oh, we'll need to find you a Kiwi. We need to get you here in New Zealand. No way you can blimmin' meet an Australian." So I think it was my last couple of days in New Zealand, and I hadn't met a Kiwi, and I think, which was fine. I wasn't looking, no blimmin' time to meet anyone. You're on the move all the time. And I had a phone call with Shane McNanaway. And I said to him, "Look, I'm off to Australia in a couple of days, and can you recommend a few people to give me a real insight into Australian agriculture?" And one of those individuals was Mitch Hyatt. And he was based in Orange, and he works across New South Wales and across Queensland. And I actually met him on day 2 of Australia. So that was probably a bit of a shock, to be honest. But then I spent 6 weeks traveling across Australia, and I saw Mitch lots. And over the last year, I did make that decision. I don't know yet what my next steps are necessarily going to be. And with the work I'm wanting to do, it's going to be global anyway. Those conversations for me are important around global agriculture. And Mitch is quite set up in a beautiful part of Australia. So yeah, I made the decision. I moved here just on Christmas Day, which I think a lot of people will probably think, "Oh my goodness, your poor family." And it wasn't easy. But I just, for various reasons, I had to be then. And I headed over on the 25th of December. And I've been here for the last few months, settling into a new climate, new conversations. And the Australians, they're great fun and they've got such a laid back attitude. And I guess British people in general, I'm sure people will argue with me in this, but they're quite uptight and we follow rules and we're quite structured. And the Kiwis certainly don't, and the Australians don't. So I think there's something about that which is very welcoming to me.
Excellent. Yeah, well, we're very glad that Mitch managed to convince you to move. And that is quite bold. I don't think I've heard of anyone moving, like selling the house and like when they go on a Nuffield to absolutely pull up stumps. That's somewhat keen. But yeah, anyway, it's obviously worked out.
Yes. I mean, but it has helped finance part of it. Nuffield can be quite expensive. So the house money helped a little bit.
yeah, exactly. So I guess if we do just quickly drill into what you did find in that Nuffield, the main findings that you'd sort of think that everyone should hear about? So
as I travelled, and I went to sort of set the scene, I travelled to around 16 countries. I was in 6 continents, and I really tried to speak to a broad spectrum of people involved in agriculture. So really across the supply chain, I was sitting down with mostly farmers, but I spoke to agronomists, I spoke to scientists, policymakers, journalists, activists, like sort of everybody that I felt had a real stake in influencing perceptions and conversations around agriculture. And I was asking them questions around how they felt perceptions were changing within the industry, how they felt they were being viewed, and having these kind of really big, deep conversations, as well as learning about different agricultural practices. So I spoke to well over 500 individuals. So my brain is still swimming a little bit as I try and dissect and process all the conversations. But I really quickly learned as I was traveling that anti-farming sentiment, if you're looking for it, you're going to find it, because really that negativity swirls and it rises to the surface and it's easy to find. So I could have come back home or now to Australia and said, there is an increase in policy which is looking to not be beneficial to farming, or it's unrealistic timelines for change. And there is a rise in these movements or activists who are tackling farming, and journalists can be quite negative in their reporting. That is everywhere. And I could have come back and said that, but that's obvious. And we're all seeing that happening. But so what I really focus on instead was that response to the scrutiny, because agriculture, like any sector in society, is under increasing scrutiny because we are so aware of climate change. We're so aware of our targets that we have to meet. So whether that's the energy sector, whether that's farming, everybody's being asked more questions. So what interested me was, how is agriculture responding? And on the whole, I felt that agriculture was very much on the defensive. It was very reactive. So I found, in terms of our communications, our advocacy, it was often being backed into the corner and reacting. And that was creating this quite negative perception of agriculture as always being quite aggressive. And our communication as part of that was often not really resonating with those that needed to understand and build empathy and care about what farming was doing. And it really worried me that way things were moving, and that echo chamber thinking. And I was echo chamber thinking. All I did in Scottish agriculture was I knew everything going on. I knew every person, individual, every business about agriculture. And I suddenly thought, I don't know really what's happening as part of the bigger picture. What's happening in the energy sector? Why is funding being cut? Because, our health system is struggling, our education, our housing. When you step out of that, you realize there's so many competing pressures. And I felt that agriculture wasn't really getting into that space and seeing it as within the much wider picture. So that was one of my main findings, was looking at the place agriculture had been sort of pushed into, that sort of reactive space, that kind of echo chamber thinking. And it was about, what examples could I find of where agriculture was really moving past those kind of farming circles, was really resonating more proactively and positively with the public. And I found lots of examples, particularly certain sectors. I mean, agritourism, I know that's in New Zealand. I think you've got quite a healthy agritourism industry, and back home in Scotland, we've got thriving agritourism industry, but often there's a bit of a negativity around agritourism. Is it real farming? If you can't farm and make money, why should you be doing that? And I've really challenged that narrative as I've been traveling, because I've said, if this sector gives an opportunity to not only provide multiple income streams in an environment which farmers, they're making such little money, those margins in the UK, 0.5%. I mean, farming is a really tight industry to be working in. So if you can bring, the next generation back to the farm and offer them an income, how amazing. But moving on from the obvious one, the thing that tied into my topic was the fact it was a real PR arm for agriculture. You've got that shop window into what farmers are doing. You're building relationships directly with the public. So I visited some amazing agritourism places. I mean, Hobbiton in New Zealand, I had no idea. that fitted into agritourism, because I only went there because I'm a massive Lord of the Rings fan. And suddenly I was finding out, they've got 500,000 visitors yearly, and they're learning about the family farm there, because it's a sheep farm first, and then they obviously brought on the hobbit holes and everything. And that opportunity to learn about farming, because there was as I was there. So agritourism, I felt, was this amazing opportunity. And then you had the likes of Jeremy Clarkson's farm. Everybody listening everyone knows Clarkson's farm, and that tells you something. That is why he's such a good communicator. And he has millions of viewers around the world. I don't think I visited any of those 16 countries where someone said, "What do you think of Clarkson?"
Yeah.
And I said, what I think of him is different to what I think his ability to support agriculture is. But he's a master in how to communicate, to connect. And he is probably... he's way more academic than I am, but he's way more simplistic than I am. And the way he is able to make the simplest complicated regulation in the UK and explain that to your average punter. He passes the pub test. People get around and they rally around him. He is an expert communicator. And I think people are now following the kind of Clarkson model, and they're getting more simplistic. They're reaching out. He has paved the way for such positivity in that space. And I've also seen some wonderful businesses who, instead of shying away from criticism, have really owned their mistakes. So particularly in Africa, I saw a lot of really big farms. And I mean farms with 400 or 500 employees who they'd been embroiled in human rights scandals and things that, their reputation had been in tatters, their retail, their contracts had been dropped, and they'd taken this completely transparent approach to saying, this is all the things that can go wrong in what we're doing, but we're being proactive in telling you that. I think that's something when I talk to farmers now about it, is sometimes we're scared to acknowledge the problems in our farm. We're embarrassed to show things aren't working, or that there's mistakes or things we're trying to hide, when actually that transparency and honesty is what builds connection. And that's what we're missing sometimes, because we're so scared to connect until things are perfect, that we're not allowing people in to see the journey. So, I mean, that's obviously quite broad that I'm speaking, because there's so many examples. I'm sure if people read my report one day, they can read more about it. But that's sort of broadly speaking some of the things that I saw.
Yeah, excellent. We'll continue to drill into those thoughts. And obviously you're now set up in business to kind of drive that further. I guess just quickly contrasting home to Australia, you've already said that people are cruisier or more laid back. But I guess in terms of ag, have there been sort of big sort of, wow, that's different versus, I guess, what I find, I haven't travelled as extensively as you have, but getting around the world, talking to people in agriculture, there's always a common element. You can always find something in common with a farmer. I guess, what have you found different? What have you found the same as you've sort of moved around?
So what I found probably the same and different in Australia as I have in other places is that everybody talks about the weather. That's the primary concern for every business. It's just the context of that weather is different. So I've come from the west coast of Scotland, a particularly high rainfall region. It's mostly pasture-based systems, and you've got more days of rain than you do of blue skies. Whereas I've moved to Orange, which is traditionally a slightly cooler climate in Australia and New South Wales. However, in the last 3 months, I can count on two hands how much rain we've had. And that was a real shock for me, and learning about, there's farmers in New South Wales and Victoria preparing for drought, whereas simultaneously there's a cyclone hitting the Gold Coast where there's 400 millimetres of rain in a day and a half. And that climate variability was a real contrast for me. So yes, Scotland, all we really talk about is the weather, because we can't get onto the fields. You've got to bring livestock in over winter because the weather's so bad. Whereas here, it's the adaptability of Australian farmers that has really blown me away. And even when we think about, I guess farming, I realize, and farming operations, it's not often a choice. It's about what you can farm to those conditions. And Australia's really taught me that. And it's made me understand a lot more about the feedlot industry and about that kind of drought-proofing regions. And I think that's been the real kind of thing for me here, is farming to suit your climate. In terms of other similarities, probably resilience. I think there's a real common theme around that strong kind of bouncing back from change and troubles. I think that is a real agricultural kind of mental kind of spirit, I guess, is that resilience. I think sometimes that comes at a cost too. I think mental health is a conversation in both places that really concerns me. I've done a lot of coverage on it as a journalist. And I do think, particularly in these very isolated rural communities, I think there is that need to be tough, particularly around men and not opening up. And I've seen it here. And because I'm quite an emotional person and I tend to ask quite deep questions, and it can be quite confronting to people. But often it's because people don't want to open up or be vulnerable. And I think that's something in agriculture I've noticed, in Scotland and in Australia and in New Zealand. I saw it a lot when I was over there. And when you ask the right questions, often people wanted to share. But often we don't do that. We don't. We just say, "How you doing, mate?" I can't do it. Good day, mate. But there's not always that depth of doing that. So I think that's something. There's some amazing initiatives. I know Farmstrong in New Zealand. We've copied Farmstrong in New Zealand. We've now got it in Scotland, and it's just the most fantastic initiative. And there's other ones like it. But I think there's a long way to go. But all three of these countries are around opening up more. So yeah, and that's definitely something I've seen.
Yeah, great points. And we're definitely going to see more of that as we go through our careers. I think there's some great initiatives happening, but we need more of it, and we need a different conversation, which obviously is starting to evolve. We might just take a quick sidestep and chat about what's going on right now in your home country in terms of a bit of unrest, and we only see what we see on social media, but obviously there's a bit of action going on, and I guess what's happening and maybe your perspective on the risks of what's happening maybe.
Yeah, and I think it's actually quite timely for my report, what's happening. So here's me in Australia and there's what's happening back home. Everyone keeps pointing this out to me. But basically, for those that maybe aren't aware of it, over the last 9 months in the UK, we've had a change of government. We've moved from the Conservative government to Labour. They came in June. And in their first budget announcement in the October, they basically revealed that they were going to lift inheritance tax relief for farmers. So all farmers who are sitting on land and assets with a value over £1 million were going to have to pay 20%. And this sent absolute shockwaves throughout the UK because the modelling done by the Labour government has been arguably wrong. They've said that 25% of farming businesses would be affected by this, but they added into their calculations your sort of smaller businesses, more your small holdings, as opposed to those productive businesses. And the actual figures have come out. 76% of UK farmers are now under threat by this. And I think I mentioned it earlier, Mark, some of the margins that farmers operate on in the UK, 0.5%, there's no cash flow. So if a business is suddenly having to find a couple $100,000 a year, they're just going to be put out of business. And there's a real concern because land values in the UK are increasing. But in terms of that cash flow, some farmers are earning £17,000 a year. There's no way they can pay off this considerable fee. And I think there's a disconnect with farmers being seen as very rich. And I do think the way it's been communicated in the media hasn't been great because you've seen farmers protesting and some of them are turning up in their tweed coats and their Range Rovers and their fancy John Deere tractors. And what image does that send? That's worried me a little bit because people are saying, oh, you're meant to be struggling. But the reality is agriculture is struggling. And we in the UK, we're very proud of that generational element. There's 10, 11 year generations and farms and that idea of passing it on. And the majority of farmers that I've ever known in Scotland, for example, have said, we're farming this land to pass it on for the next generation. It's not to make money. We're proud of it. It's our heritage. And that cultural aspect is really under threat massively. So that's one element. So that has seen farmers get to the streets against the new government and to really put salt in the wound just before the Labour government came in. They'd made a commitment saying, as every potential government says in their pre-election sort of amble, they said, we're going to protect the future of the family farm. We're going to protect food security. And that's what they'd said. But this has been seen as, a complete flip on that. As you can imagine, I know there's been similarities. You've seen it in New Zealand over the years, and in Australia, we've seen it. So that was one element of it. And then just in the last couple of weeks, we've had another thing that's added salt to the wound, and that's been that the payment mechanism for farm payments in England, and I'm being specific here to England, because since we left the EU, we left the Common Agricultural Policy, and that was what decided our subsidies for agriculture. And we've designed our own farm payment systems. And in England, it was called the Sustainable Farming Initiative. So with the Sustainable Farming Initiative was basically giving farming, removing that basic payment. So it wasn't about how much farm you owned, which is what it previously was, that payment. It was basically based on your environmental goods. So it was about what you were doing for water management, for hedgerow management, planting trees. It was about the kind of environmental goods you were delivering on farm. And that was where farmers are moving towards. It was quite a complicated system. It involved having to bring in advisors to really support in that, and that cost money. Yeah. And what had happened was a lot of the sort of bigger farms who had the money had brought in farm advisors, and they'd sort of sent off their bids for this process, and they'd been locked into this new initiative. But around 50% of farmers hadn't done that. And what happened in the last couple of weeks is they shut down the scheme. And they said, if you're not already in it, you're not getting into the scheme anymore. We've put a cap on it. So you've got half of the farmers in England, and probably the half that need the money, who haven't applied for this scheme, who are now worried about the inheritance tax relief being lifted, worried about the fact that they're not going to have these payments coming in. And so you can imagine the pandemonium that's happening, and there's protests in the streets of Westminster and all over. In Scotland, just to sort of clarify a little bit, in Scotland, we're a little bit luckier. Our government went a slightly different way. We decided to maintain an area-based payment for about 50% for farms. And that was basically because of our rural communities and the fact that in those areas, if we lose farming from those areas, and those areas are 90%, some of those hill farmers 90% of their income might be derived from that payment. But that money could be £1 that generates £7 back into that rural economy. And that was noticed by the government, and we needed to keep the schools. We needed to keep those services. So I think we'd been slightly different in that, but the other 50% was based on that environmental side. So that's what's happening at home. I mean, I'm not as up to date as some people with it's constantly changing, but I'm going back in a few weeks, and it'll be an interesting time. We'll be coming up to a year since Labour government came in, but yeah, there's a lot of upset farmers right now in the UK.
Yeah, and rightly so by the sound of all that. And yeah, I guess we're not going to even go close to solving those problems today. But yeah, it is interesting that it's seemingly governments all over the place are putting us under heat. And I guess maybe that's something we can go to now, as in a lot of producers do feel like they're constantly playing defence with the media, and you've already talked about that, and public perception. I guess our listeners are out there doing their thing. Is there any go-to advice that they can sort of do individually to flip that dynamic? Like, I mean, obviously you can't control who gets elected into government, but what are the things that you would like to see, I guess, and the things that what are you suggesting people do?
So one of the quotes that really stood out to me when I was traveling was, I was told that farmers are outliers in a society that does short-term thinking. And why this is critical here is that I think agriculture has dropped into a short-term thinking in terms of its communication and advocacy, when agriculture is completely long-term. Yeah. Everything that we do has to sustain for generations and generations. Yet often our communication and advocacy is quite short-term. So when it comes to what can farmers do within this, I think we've got to be really realistic, and it's not going to change overnight. I think we've got to start shifting mentality into a longer term view of where we can start building back some of the trust and some of the reputation and the relationships. And so for me, that's about governments come and go. You know, it's like a pendulum swim. I've seen a pendulum swing all over the world. There's been change of governments happening. I know when I came to New Zealand, you just change at that point to your new government. But often we're focusing on who's in the term currently. We're not looking ahead to what's coming down the track, building those relationships, making sure when the next government in power comes in, they understand, engage, and can represent effectively farmers' needs. And that is a problem I am seeing all over the world. And I mean, I'm going to call out Australia here as an example, because they have seen the ban on live exports of sheep. And it's a real concern here. I know even just today, I saw they're about to hold another protest about it and showcase, our facilities are great. We're setting the standard for live animal exports. That is the case, and I agree with that. The problem is, when this was first raised as an issue by the Labour government, I can't remember if it was 2018 or when they first raised it, they said, if we come into government, we are going to ban live animal exports of sheep. But at that point, from the people I've spoken to who worked in government at the time, or to some of the organizations, there wasn't engagement happening when that warning bells were put out there. There wasn't that sort of, that's tomorrow's problem. So then this has come in, Labour's come in on a mandate to deliver that, and that's not going to change because that is they have to deliver their mandate. And now everyone's up in arms and everyone's rightly upset and concerned. But the problem is we didn't take the long-term view. And that is where we've got to start thinking a lot more strategically about what's coming down the track, what the priorities are, who we're having those moments with and those engagements with. So maybe I realize, Mark, I've probably slightly, that's for your organizations and your kind of lobbying bodies, that's a role for them, but that's also for members and for farmers to be aware of those relationships as well, and about making sure that they're being represented in the right way. I think in terms of our communication, I think it's very easy to speak to ourselves. It's about maybe attending those events or those conferences that maybe aren't just primarily concerned with the future of agriculture. Because I always say, you take to your tractor for a protest. When do you take to the streets because there's a protest about junior doctors or about, nurses going on strike, or we had train drivers in the UK? I mean, this affects everyone in society, not just how we often think we just get out there for agriculture. I think it's about actually looking a lot wider, about taking a step outside and saying, how do I show up and show that we're interested in what's happening more widely? Because I definitely think we're very good at doing that for ourselves. We're not always good at listening and engaging in other ways. And I'm never going to tell all farmers to be communicators. I'm not going to tell them all to be PR superstars. I mean, that's the last thing a farmer can add to their plate. And some people probably shouldn't be communicators. I'd probably not say every farm should invite the public on and have an open farm Sunday, but there's different ways you can communicate. And I'm going to use my mum as an example. She's quite introverted. She's not someone who's going to stand up at a rally and take the microphone or go on social media. But I always say to her, you're a great communicator, because, if you're out at your hairdressers, or we've got another business that doesn't just speak to farmers, you're always talking and sharing your passion and your love for this industry in different ways. So it's about valuing the way we communicate that isn't always those really public displays of it. Because I think there's a way that everybody can to start to build that. But I do think we need to start looking to build relationships out with just our farming circles if we can. And that's something, our lobbying bodies, I've been on the receiving end of press releases that come out, and there's no way the BBC or ABC or anyone would pick up a story, because what's the relevance to the everyday consumer? So you've got to start thinking, how do we step into the shoes of people who aren't just ourselves, and why should it matter to them? Because let's be honest, not everybody's interested in farming. Everybody has a stake in food. And who produces food? And we've got to reframe that conversation, because if we start thinking about food and we start thinking about food scarcity, everybody is interested. We saw COVID. I mean, we had supermarket shelves that were empty. Everybody wants to talk about food. And that's when you had an active audience. I think it's about changing the narrative, the conversation slightly.
Yeah, cool. Interesting. You've already mentioned Clarkson's Farm. Have you got, I guess, other examples of farmers or ag businesses that are kind of doing a really good job of telling their story and in different ways, no doubt? But I guess what makes their approach work well?
One thing I actually saw when I was in New Zealand that really impressed me was it was a farm about an hour from north of Christchurch. And they told me that they were very active in their local Facebook group. And they showed me certain things that they put on there. And what they'd done, which had really impressed me, is I think they were doing some stubble burning, and they put a post up maybe the week before saying, just to let everyone know, we're going to be doing this. And if you want to come and learn about it or see what we're doing, this is what's happening. Then when it happened, they put pictures up, they explained what they were doing. And I just thought that was a really proactive way of bringing people into the journey, giving them an opportunity to see and understand it. And it was quite transparent, because I know if suddenly I'm driving down the motorway and I just see lots of fire coming out of a field, and then I'm going to be pretty angry. I'm going to be thinking, what on earth's going on? Is that a bushfire or someone, but you don't know what it is. So I think that was really impressive for me, is actually pulling people into the journey from the start. There are some amazing farms who are just being really active on social media. It's an amazing opportunity where they're telling the sort of warts and all approach. I think that's a really great way of doing it. It's not just all Barber jacket. I mean, this is UK references, Barber jackets and Range Rovers and fancy headers. there's a tough side of things too. Like we've got lambing happening right now, and it's pretty emotional. It's an exhausting time for farmers. Luckily we've got good weather, but we've seen sometimes they're lambing out in high snowfall, and it's showing the reality and building empathy. I know some of your farming programs can be fantastic at doing that. Like Landline, like showing the reality of what's happening too. So I think it's telling the full story and bringing people in and not patronizing. The biggest no I'm going to tell you about, and I would love to remove this expression from our language altogether, would be we need to educate the public. It's patronizing, it's alienating, it puts up bridges. And we talk about this rural-urban disconnect. The disconnect is often created by those in agriculture because the public they're curious, and sometimes that curiosity comes across as scrutiny or, aggression even, but it's not. It's asking questions. And if someone has the courage to ask and be interested, we've got to show up and see it as an opportunity and to engage, not to educate. Because I think, we've also got to be in a position where we're actively listening and changing what we do. And if someone is not comfortable with how we're farming, we'll think, well, they're my customer at the end of the day. Yeah, I know it's harder in New Zealand because you're export focused. You don't often see that end customer, and that's a harder conversation to have. And it's the same in Australia. But I know, for example, like just speaking to the feedlot industry in Australia, I've been so impressed by they're actually actively coming forward and saying, what criticism would we be getting from customers, and what can we be proactively doing now to make sure when this all comes to the fore, we're already ahead of the game. So I think it's about stepping into the shoes of consumers and saying, what do they want from us? And whether that's, conversations around mulesing, difficult, ethical, emotional conversation happening. But I can tell you, speaking to Scottish farmers, they're very critical of Australian sheep farmers around mulesing. And that conversation there, but actually I've met with plenty of farmers who are doing, their self-shedding coats. So like having conversations about some of the genetics and the changes that are happening out there. And this is what we're proactively doing, because often that conversation goes straight back into the negative and what's happening. So it's about trying to own the conversation in a really positive way.
Yeah, I love that. Engage, not educate. That's something that you'll probably hear more on this podcast, I reckon. But yeah, that's awesome. So you're now set up in Orange. You've set up your own business. What's that look like? How do people, or I guess who are your target clients, and how do people find you and find out more?
Yeah, so in the last few weeks, I've just launched Agvocacy Consulting, and this has been. It's been the brainchild of multiple things. It's been 10 years in sort of journalism and media and sort of my skill set within that. But it's also been my sort of passion and love for agriculture combined with my Nuffield Scholarship findings, and trying to come up with how do we rethink our agricultural communications and advocacy in different ways. And there's lots of people out there. There's some brilliant, PR and communication people out there who are already doing things like that. Whereas I'm not going to be there to do the day-to-day delivery of a social media plan. That isn't where I'm going to come in, because really I'm still a journalist at heart and I'm still a storyteller. But what I want to do is to do the high-level strategy and take a look at businesses and ask probably quite difficult questions, and ask about not just social license, but about social conscience, and to come up with a plan to engage more effectively with wider stakeholders, to look at maybe where a business or an individual isn't really having cut through, and to think about a plan to do that. That's one of the things I want to do as part of this. And it's going to be very customized to the individual business, because there's not a blanket approach to this. It's got to be very customized to location, region, audiences that I'm working with. But then also drawing from my training and expertise, I want to do workshops. So I want to deliver workshops around communications and media, and just to really empower, whether it's farmers, or I've done quite a few already for boards, where looking at how they can control the narrative in conversations with journalists. And having been on both sides, I'm often interviewed, I'm often doing the interview. I've worked for farming media, non-farming media. I do a lot of practical sessions on how to really give individuals the confidence to communicate and to really feel that they're telling the narrative they want to tell. So that's something I love doing. It's empowering people to tell that. But also I'm an MC and facilitator. And I love doing that, Mark, because, as an MC, you get to attend conferences with hundreds or thousands of delegates, and you get to shape the engagement for those delegates too. And that's a big thing for me, is how do we make the most for delegates out of a conference, and you can influence speakers who are coming in. And I love leading those conversations too. So that's something I've been doing as part of my, yes, I did quit my job, but I was very lucky doing my Nuffield Scholarship that I started picking up MC gigs around the world, and I've got quite a few this year, which is exciting. And I'm very lucky. I'm coming back to New Zealand. I'm going to be speaking at the Primary Industries Summit on the 24th of June. So I get to come and speak to farmers. I think you've got about 800 that come to that conference, which is just fantastic. In your hometown. In
my hometown, but that everyone wants to come to in June. I don't know. It's probably the last place you want to be in June. But anyway, that'd be. Although Orange would be pretty cool in June as well.
That'd be cold as well. I don't know. I'm used to it.
yeah, you're from the right part of the world. Awesome. It's been a great chat, Claire. The last couple of questions are, one of them is a recent addition to the podcast. One I've been asking for a while. But the first one is, what's the last thing you changed your mind about?
What's the last thing I changed my mind about? So honestly, I change my mind pretty often because I'm challenged constantly, and I'm always open to change. But I would say, I think it's quite an important and significant change for me, was around feedlots. I started my traveling, and I was very much from an extensively grazed, pasture-based farming background. I mentioned my Belted Galloways earlier, and my mum being a vet. And it was all about, in my opinion, I had all these ideas around animal welfare, animal behavior, and I was quite critical. And then I started traveling and learning more about the importance of feedlots, the social dimension, and so many other wider parts to it. And it completely shifted my perspective. And it's been really important to me. And then I guess recently with the drought warnings, learning about how important feedlots can be in terms of nutrition and how much care and attention can go into supporting those animals too. So I think for me, that has been a big change. And that's partly why I'd love to do some work in the feedlot industry, is because I've had my perception completely changed as a result of having really transparent conversations and being invited into feedlots from Indonesia to Japan to Australia, all over the place, Brazil. And I think it's an industry which is criticised all over the world, and it really is, particularly from outside farming and within farming too. So I think there's a story there that I think isn't always communicated as well as it could be.
Cool, and that's why we ask the question, to get answers like that one. It's awesome, because we often get deeper than what often people have been. The last one, which is a new one, is, who's the best human you've had the pleasure to learn from?
So it definitely has to be my mum. My mum is a wonderful vet, and she is just a wonderful human being in terms of the way she treats people. And I think that's probably been my biggest learning growing up, is watching the way my mum builds relationships with people. And I think sometimes in conversations, whether it's agriculture, politics, whatever we're talking about, we often lose sight of people and that the relationship side. So I think my mum has always been really in her community. She's always just been so giving with her time, and so she's such a great listener. She's so curious, and she's so kind. And I think these are all qualities that are really important for anybody. But I think learning from her growing up and just seeing the way she treated her animals, to the way she treated clients, to our kennels and cattery, the way she treated her friends. And I know it's not a farming answer necessarily, but it's definitely where I've based how I've been as an individual moving forward, the way I built relationships, whether it was at the BBC, the Scottish Farmer, doing my Nuffield travels. I've always just been so interested in people, and I've always really cared deeply for other people's stories and been very curious. And I don't think I would have had that if I hadn't grown up around a mum who was just so endlessly giving and curious and such a good listener and very humble. I think journalists aren't often known for being very humble. And I've actually really struggled because my mum has always been very grounded. She pulls me down to earth. If I start getting, too ahead of myself, she pulls me right down there and reminds me about just those ordinary conversations and always treating everybody the same. And I think she's been a really grounding and steady and inspiring presence in my life.
What a cracking way to end this interview. That's fantastic. Thanks, Claire. Thanks very much for your time. And thanks for all that you're doing for ag. And really looking forward to what that's going to look like over the next few years, and thrilled that you're part of Trans-Tasman Ag these days, or Global Ag as well, obviously. But great to have you on board, and thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Cheers. Thanks again to Heineken, who are proud world leaders in the manufacturing and supply of professional sheep shearing and clipping equipment. Thank you to MNSD Animal Health and Norflex Livestock Intelligence. They offer an extensive livestock product portfolio focused on animal health management, all backed up by exceptional service. We thank both of these companies for their ongoing support of the Head Shepherd podcast.